much. I thought I would pick up on the theme of bystanders and think about who do we characterise as a bystander? Who is a bystander? Who stands by and does nothing? Are they unchanged by history? Are they not part of history? Is by standing by being neutral? Quite often when we use the word bystander in common parlance out with this sort of context, we use the word innocent. They were an innocent bystander. That means that they were caught up in the crossfire of something. They were without power, and they were quite often an unintentional and indirect victim of what occurred. When you take the word innocent away from the word bystander, we are presented with quite a different impression of what that word may or may not mean. And it becomes quite difficult to then figure out how law is going to deal with the bystander. Law is focused on winners and losers. Law focuses on perpetrators and victims. And indeed, such was the case after the Second World War. This was tricky because, of course, Nazi Party membership was in the multi-millions. Was a trial of multi-millions appropriate? Was it even feasible? No, certainly wasn't. In 1946, over 66,000 Germans remained in custody, and it was unclear whether or not that was just the tip of the iceberg, or was already into the realms of far too many people in custody to manage. So, how was it going to be done? Well, I think we have to be clear that, before we get going a wee bit too further, that there are two types of bystander in my world. There are individual bystanders who tend to be internal to the site of atrocity, and institutional bystanders who tend to be external to the site of atrocity. After the Second World War, it became an issue as to who was going to be prosecuted, how many, and what for, and what were you going to do with the rest. Because perpetrators were probably quite easy to establish, and indeed, I'm quite struck that Henry is from Nuremberg, that indeed, of course, the Nuremberg Tribunal is the path-breaking tribunal for international criminal justice, and it provided an architecture, a judicial, accountable architecture for accountability. It set clear precedent, it broke legal ground in crimes against humanity definition, and in its attack upon the high-level officials, and if you read Robert Jackson's opening address at the trial, he makes a very clear distinction between what it was to be German and what it was to be a Nazi. And one sees here in the Nuremberg trial an attempt to draw, for lawyers, a clear difference between what might be responsibility, moral perhaps, legal, something else, and guilt. And these are very, very important categories to be clear about. Of course, the Nuremberg trial as a judicial reckoning was not the last word on post-World War II in Germany. Justice, if I might put it like that, and the denazification programme was then introduced. It was introduced and administered by four powers: Russia, France, the US, and the UK. And it became almost impossible to manage, because you were looking at roughly denazifying 70 million people. How would you categorise them? Major offender, offender, follower, journeyman? As time went on, the scale of the programme became very clear to the Allies, and they were also keen, as we would see now, to think about exit strategy. How to do this quickly, how to do it efficiently, how to do it financially manageably. And the downside of that was, of course, that amnesties were introduced quite quickly into the programme, and this resulted in fairly significant offenders being reclassified as mere followers or simply being subject to a fine and escaping what might have been considered to be their proper responsibility for what had happened. But there was no other way to do it. How would we do it in modern times? The denazification programme has been reused as an idea in many post-conflict societies. Iraq was de-Ba'athized, and Eastern Germany, after the wall came down, was similarly cleaned. But there was a desire to do it better this time. But what would we have done? Nowadays, what we would have done is hold the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We would have asked bystanders to come and tell their story. because there is no other way for them to do that, because they didn't actually commit a crime within the narrow understanding of what is criminal. That is about legal responsibility, not moral responsibility. And so the big innovation that denazification sort of left was that it wasn't enough to take someone out of their job, to never allow them to hold public office. You're going to have to do something more to understand why this happened, why it happened overnight, why, as Henry described, how quickly things spiraled out of control. This would be a way to try and find out and make sure it never happened again. And what you will find nowadays is Sierra Leone, Rwanda, South Africa famously will have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. However, no, don't worry, it's my last point. In terms of institutional bystanding, external to the site of the conflict, let's step back to the 1930s. Who would we say bore responsibility there? The Allied nations, who refused to take refugees. The League of Nations, well, its failure is well documented. The churches as institutions rather than as individuals, and this is another problem that Henry recounted again. For example, the protection of individuals, but not their governing institution, which refused to take a line. And I would just leave you with one thought, which is in the Bosnia-Serbia decision of 2007, Bosnia had brought a case against Serbia complaining that it had been guilty of genocide. Serbia was found not to be responsible for genocide. However, it was found responsible for failing to prevent genocide, notably at Srebrenica. Of course, the Bosnians were still unhappy with that as a conclusion and will still endeavour to find that smoking gun. And I think we probably haven't heard the last of that case. But the interesting thing will be, if we think about a failure to prevent genocide, which is a high threshold, a lower threshold is a failure to prevent crimes against humanity. Which states do you think might be held responsible for failing to prevent a crime against humanity in the next few years to come, when we see yet more pictures, and there will be more pictures, of atrocities lying on beaches in the Mediterranean?